Ladies, I'm so excited for the school year to start and just get really organized.
And I think there's a few steps that we need to take before we start with our lesson planning.
Great. I'd love to just review the process and consider what materials we might need for our team outcomes for today.
Great. Well, based on our agenda that we created today, we said that we were going to take the interim assessment so we would be able to really understand what students are expected to do to demonstrate proficiency on the standards. We also said that we would look at the standards assessed in that first interim quarter to see where the standards are in the curricular resource so that we could create a pacing guide for ourselves. And then really kind of unpacking that standard and the assessment questions to create our no-show chart and really determine the level of rigor that kids are expected to meet. And then thinking about, are those standards represented thoroughly throughout the curricular resource? And then lastly, we said we would dig really deep into the curricular resource to identify, do those learning activities match the same level of rigor that we identified in our no-show?
Great.
And as I looked through the agenda, I figured out that there were a number of tools that we probably should have. So I want to make sure we all have these. So the first one is the interim assessment, and a little note taker on that so that will help us to what we noticed as we took the assessment. We also have a standards and pacing guide, and we also have a pacing guide specifically for 6th grade ELA. In addition to that, we have our curricular resource that talks about the modules that'll happen in quarter 1. We have kind of an overarching note catcher that will help us to synthesize all of the steps that we're going through. And finally, we have our priority standards from Mapleton, from SharePoint for ELA 6th grade.
Great. Thanks, Candy. Let's get started taking the assessment. We all have our assessment and our note catcher, writing down components or important parts of it that we really feel would be important for our students to demonstrate mastery on this interim assessment.
Great.
Teachers take the interim assessment to experience the type of questions that students will need to demonstrate mastery on. This helps build empathy for students as well as truly understand the level of rigor that is needed in lesson and unit design.
Wow, I didn't realize how complex some of these questions are going to be. It makes me think that maybe we should take a look at our curriculum resource and see if that has that same level of complexity or rigor. And then I'm also thinking we might want to consider at some point what some scaffolds are that will help ensure that all students have opportunities to access this high-level curriculum.
Taking this assessment really makes me feel like I need to review some of the texts that I might have offered during the school year, as well as really unpacking those grade level standards.
I think that's really important work. Before we do that today, though, let's take a look at where our standards that are assessed in our interim pacing document and where they fall in our curricular resource so that we can create a pacing guide that will really help us identify where those standards appear as we're teaching them.
Great. So we were looking at, so these are all of our quarter 1 standards. So we'll go in and identify within what unit and modules they are.
Great, let's do that.
All right. RL 6.1. Well, now that we've identified that our standard that we're going to look at is RI 6.2, which is determine a central idea of a text and how it is conveyed through particular details, provide a summary of the text distinct from personal opinions or judgments. What do you think the big ideas that we need to focus on when we're considering our unit planning would be?
I think they certainly have to know what the main idea is.
Great.
Agreed. I'm gonna write that down under big ideas.
So as students identify the main idea, they'll also need to understand important or key details, and then use that to provide a summary.
And I think there's another thinking skill that they need to have at that point, which is that they have to be able to identify the difference between a big idea or main idea and supporting details.
That's going to allow them to really just compare and contrast and make those distinctions.
Discriminate, right.
Yeah, great. So if we look at the test, number 5, it asks students which statement summarizes the central idea of the story they just read around Booker T. Washington. When I took the test and I looked at the specific answer choices that were offered, I knew right away that I could eliminate B and D because either that detail wasn't mentioned or it really didn't support a central idea. What I thought was difficult really, were responses A, where it said Booker T. Washington used creative solutions to overcome challenges for his school, because I found that in the first paragraph, it really, one of the pieces of evidence I would have cited would have been, my plan was not to teach them to work in the old way, but to show them how to make the forces of nature, air, water, steam, electricity, horsepower, a system. And that made me think that that was a really creative solution. And another creative solution was that students were actually constructing these buildings. Answer C says Booker T. Washington taught students how to construct buildings using modern methods. That is actually true. And a large part of the text that we read in this assessment talked about the different ways in which students were building a kiln, creating bricks. And so I could see how students would possibly pick C.
That's like a distractor.
It is. And really thinking about,
The team continues to analyze the assessment questions and unpack the different answers and possible distractors to determine what students truly need to know and show.
So now that we've created our know and show on our note catcher, let's determine the level of rigor and see how it matches with the learning activities in the curriculum resource. And from our pacing guide that we created, we noticed that the standard 6RI.2 appears in module 1, 2, and 3, but for our purposes, we're going to need to just focus on module 1 because that's where the only one we'll be covering before the interim's taken.
Okay, great. Well, we were talking a little bit about the DOK levels, and so I pulled those up. And so when we said that students would need to determine the central idea in a text, as we looked through the DOK levels and the verbs, we really said that.
I think that sometimes determining the central idea might be a lower level of rigor, but in this particular text, the central idea isn't as apparent as you pointed out, and students need to assess and critique the details to determine the central idea and identify why other choices are not the central idea.
That's a great point, Candy. Just thinking about the complexity of the text and that it's not apparent, I think we need to really unpack the skills that students might need. So looking at our no-show chart, for the second show, we identified students will need to cite textual evidence to support their central idea, which is, as you said earlier, Allison, a DOK 3 evaluate. And the other component is just really to synthesize key details to write a summary to support that central idea, which we really thought was even a higher level skill with the DOK 4.
Yeah, I think we said that really is about extended thinking and, a focus on that complex reasoning and planning and thinking, which, falls into that metacognitive category of the taxonomy table.
And one of the examples that they give is outlining, which is really similar when you think about it to writing a summary because you have a big idea with some supporting details.
Nice work, everyone. For me, I would say determining the level of rigor is probably the most challenging, and I really appreciate having thought partners because initially when I was thinking about, determining the central idea, I thought it would be something as simple as a recall. and then I was talking to Candy earlier, and we really did unpack it and say, well, it's a lot more than just determining. They have to analyze the text. They have to distinguish between a detail, and so I probably wouldn't have gotten to that level of rigor without, you know, this team. So in thinking about, does that level of rigor match the curricular resource, we are going to go ahead and pull out, we have our scope and sequence, and then we also have the lesson where RI 6.2 is located. So if we look at Module 1, Unit 1, and this is in Greek mythology, RI 6.2 and falls under Lesson 5, and it's under a close read of why ancient Greek mythology is still relevant today. And so if we look at the text as well as the note catcher in the curricular resource, I think we can determine what the students are needing to do to demonstrate their understanding in the curricular resource, and then we can go back to those no-show charts
And see if it matches.
and see if it matches.
That makes sense.
The standard also appeared when I looked at the scope and sequence in Module 1, Unit 3, in both Lessons 2 and 4. Now, Lesson 2 was only an assessment, so there was actually no instruction on that standard, but it was assessed. But in Lesson 4, they do students dig deeper into that standard.
So we need to figure out if seeing the standard or experiencing the standard in only 2 places is sufficient for our kids. So when we look at the first close read that they're asked to do, on to the questions, the note catcher already gives the main idea and asks students to identify the supporting details. There is a 3rd section, and on that one they have to both identify and provide supporting details.
Okay. So essentially it scaffolds it in the beginning by providing them the main ideas, and then they're only working on the supporting details, and that last one, they look at the central idea or main idea, and then have to do everything on its own. Okay.
Right.
Great. And taking a look at the culminating task here that they ask students to do, it really involves some partner work and an oral summary of the Greek mythology article that they're reading. So considering the level of rigor of this culminating task and our assessment questions in our interim, just wondering how are you guys feeling about the level of rigor, and do these match?
Well, I think it is definitely building up to the level of rigor. I think that they should be discussing what they believe the main idea is, maybe even before we give them this note catcher. That way we can have a class discussion where students are probably going to present some different main ideas, and we can talk about non-examples as well as the example of the central idea.
Good idea.
I think that'll get us to that DOK 3 of discriminating and evaluating their thoughts and ideas, and then we can discuss why it would be a non-example and why wouldn't it be.
I'm a little worried about students only having maybe one or a few opportunities to practice this prior to the interim. So just to consider, how might we give students maybe some more opportunities to practice that skill?
And then we can discuss.
Teachers continue to look at the lessons within their curricular resource that attend to the standard in which they are planning for. Looking back at the no-show chart and the level of rigor that has been previously identified helps teachers to focus on any learning activities within the curricular resource that might need to be built out a little bit more or modified.
I think maybe extend the culminating activity to not only have an oral discussion, but also to write a summary.
That's a great idea.
And we could also create a model for that and showing them the main ideas and the supporting details, and then choose 1 or 2 other sections in the reading for them to summarize as well. And then that would ensure that we're meeting the same level of rigor. So now let's look ahead to Unit 3 and see how the students are summarizing to make sure that if we're asking them to write a summary in Unit 1, that it is coherent and aligns with Module 3.
Great.
Great.
Thank you, Kenny.